11 weeks after removing all public health restrictions, Alberta's open summer has come to an abrupt end.
We may run out of staffed intensive care beds within the next 10 days.
Facing a crisis in Alberta hospitals that could no longer be ignored, the Premier introduced broad new public health measures Wednesday. Alberta will no longer be wide open this fall. There are new restrictions on indoor social gatherings and for businesses, unless they opt into the restriction exemption program, Alberta's version of the vaccine passport. The Premier offered an apology of sorts.
I apologize for having embraced the public shift from pandemic to endemic, which was clearly premature. I don't apologize for having lifted public health restrictions in our Open for Summer plan.
But a summer without any restrictions has led Alberta into a crisis doctors have been trying to prevent. Former Alberta Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. James Talbot, says even with these measures, it's likely Alberta doctors will have to implement critical care triage protocols, ultimately deciding who will live and die.
The people who are going to have to make those decisions are going to be haunted by them for the rest of their lives, because they're going to have to face up with two things. One, they had to make the choice, and two, it was completely preventable.
Preventable, he says, if those in power had been listening.
One of the truly troubling things that happened in the province was that the Premier and some of his closest advisors were publicly sneering at Albertans who were trying to raise issues of public health.
A senior staff member in the Premier's office tweeted in early June, "The pandemic is ending. Accept it." Now, on the brink of a healthcare disaster, the Alberta government has accepted that was wrong. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
The pandemic is not over, and what's happening in Alberta puts it front and center days before the federal election. Abigail Bimman is traveling with the Liberal campaign. Abigail?
Donna, Justin Trudeau called the situation in Alberta heartbreaking, and while he held back from directly slamming Premier Jason Kenney, he used the opportunity to take swipes at Erin O'Toole and broadly Conservative government's handling of the pandemic.
And that's at the heart of the choice Canadians need to make in this election. Because just a few days ago, Mr. O'Toole was still applauding Mr. Kenney for his management of the pandemic.
Trudeau said he reached out to the clerk of the Privy Council to talk about supports for Alberta, and he said ventilators are now on the way to the province and Ottawa will be there to help. Trudeau was also asked about his contradictory message. He literally tells people to vote Liberal to, quote, end the pandemic, at the same time as saying it's not his job to interfere with the provinces and their decisions. The closest Trudeau came to criticizing Alberta directly was to say if they had signed on to vaccine passports sooner, things might be better right now. Donna?
All right, Abigail in Quebec, thank you. Well, the Liberals have tried to link Jason Kenney to federal Conservative Leader Erin O'Toole, who has praised Kenney's handling of the pandemic, and are hoping to capitalize on the anger in Alberta. Here's part of an ad from the Liberal candidate in Calgary Skyview.
Premier Kenney has navigated this COVID-19 pandemic far better than the federal government has. And when it comes to getting our country back on track, the federal Conservatives can learn a lot from our UCP cousin.
Our Mike Le Couteur is with the Conservatives. Mike, how is Erin O'Toole handling this?
Donna, earlier today, Erin O'Toole repeatedly refused to comment on how Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is handling the COVID-19 situation in his province. During his press conference at a curling rink, he slid around multiple questions about how, as recently as last Sunday, the federal Conservative leader praised his provincial counterpart's management of the pandemic. Despite Kenney now admitting he got it wrong, as he declared a public health emergency Wednesday, O'Toole would only say he supports province's efforts to try and fight COVID-19, each time turning it back to a criticism of Liberal leader Justin Trudeau and his management of the pandemic. Donna?
All right, Mike Le Couteur in Truro, Nova Scotia.